I found the betrayal by accident, a deed hidden in the trash. Signed years ago, quietly giving everything to my younger brother. While I was the one bleeding for that company. While I was the one keeping it alive. That was the moment something in me snapped clean. Quiet. Irreversible. Because I finally understood I wasn't building a future. I was maintaining their fantasy. And the secret they kept from me wasn't the worst part. It was what they expected me to do next. Before I continue, tell me where you're listening from? I wasn't born into Ironclad Forge so much as I was absorbed into it. Some kids grew up with bedtime stories or Little League. I grew up with the hiss of acetylene torches and the metallic tang of hot steel settling in the air. My earliest memory isn't of a toy or a family trip, it's of my father, Marcus, lifting me onto a workbench and placing a dull hammer in my hand, like he was knighting me. You hit the metal, he'd said, not your fingers. That's the rule. I was 6. That was my whole orientation. As I got older, I became the kid who never had clean clothes, who always smelled faintly of iron filings, who thought everyone knew the difference between TIG and MIG welding. While other teenagers were figuring out who they were, I was already being shaped, kneaded, and hardened like the very steel my father bent for a living. People assume that kind of upbringing creates a prodigy. It didn't. It created someone useful. My role in the family was simple. I was the eldest son, the dependable one, the one who didn't need praise or attention because I performed without it. My job wasn't to shine, it was to hold everything together. Evan, on the other hand, was the prodigy my parents wished they had, or at least the one they convinced themselves he could be. He had a bachelor's degree in industrial design and hands as soft as cushioned foam. He talked about automating inefficiencies and capturing emerging markets. And my parents practically applauded every buzzword like it was a verse from scripture. Meanwhile, I was the one crawling into fireboxes, rewiring half-dead equipment, and staying up all night finishing rush orders, so Evan could boast about ironclad scalability during family dinners. My mother, Elaine, wasn't the type to get her hands dirty not with steel, and not with the truth. She handled client relations and finances, always with a glassy smile stretched so tight it could snap. She had a gift for selective blindness, especially when it came to her younger son. My father, Marcus, was the architect of the craft, but never the emotions. Stoic, bullish, and set in his ways. He treated affection like a rare commodity, reserved for special occasions, occasions that Evan somehow always qualified for. The imbalance didn't arrive suddenly. It dripped slowly, like water carving through stone. Little things at first. When I fixed an overheating furnace that saved us thousands, my father grunted. Good. When Evan suggested we redesign the company logo, my mother announced it like a Nobel Prize. When a client praised the precision of our custom work, they assumed Evan was responsible for it. And my parents let them assume. Not out of malice, at least not at first, but because it fit the story they liked better. Evan was the visionary. I was the labor. There is a concept in psychology called the functional child, the one who becomes a tool rather than a person. I fit that role like a tailor-made glove. I did the hard jobs, the dangerous ones, the tedious ones. I learned to weld underwater for a marine contract. I took night shifts so my father could sleep. I handled invoices, suppliers, safety inspections, every unglamorous piece of the machine. And because I did all of it silently, reliably, endlessly, they forgot to see me. The only person who ever looked at me really looked was my grandfather, Henry, before he passed. He'd sit beside me in the workshop, running his fingers along the grain of a steel beam as though it were an old friend. He used to say, "Son, you've got your father's grit and your mother's heart, but that combination will get you used up if you're not careful." I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now. He also warned me about something else, though I brushed it off at the time. Some folks don't see the person doing the work, he said. They only see the work. And when the work becomes expected, the worker becomes invisible. Invisible. That word sat in my chest like a cold coin. Looking back, I can see every sign of manipulation that I refused to name. the guilt tripping when I wanted a weekend off, the casual reminders that the forge would fall apart without me, the way my mother framed my reliability as selfishness whenever I didn't bend to her expectations, and the biggest manipulation of all, the promise of a future role I was never going to receive. My father used to say, "One day, this place will be yours." He said it with the conviction of a man who believed it in the moment. And maybe he did. But conviction isn't the same as action. Somewhere between their ambitions for Evan and their dependence on me, the intention rotted. I became the scaffolding that held up the structure, while Evan was groomed to be the face on the brochure. Even when my grandfather passed and left me his old welder and a handwritten note that simply said, "For the one who works," my parents framed it as a sentimental gesture instead of the quiet coronation it was meant to be. They didn't want me to leave. They didn't want me to lead. They wanted me to remain predictable, loyal, and available. So they told me just enough to keep me invested and hid just enough to keep me trapped. The night I found that deed of transfer, everything grandfather had warned me about crystallized. They hadn't merely overlooked me, they had strategically erased me from the future of a business I had built with my bare hands. And they had done it with a level of confidence that could only come from years of me proving I would never walk away. They relied on my silence. They relied on my stability. They relied on the part of me that still wanted their approval. They expected the load-bearing wall to hold. Always. They never imagined the wall would choose to step aside. The pressure in my family didn't arrive like a sudden storm. It crept in quietly, the way rust spreads under paint slow, silent, and inevitable. Long before I found the deed that exposed everything, the signs had already been tightening around my life, with a grip I mistook for responsibility. It began with favors framed as necessities, and the kinds of things you agree to before realizing they become obligations carved into your daily bones. Come in early. Evan has a pitch meeting. Stay late. Evan isn't feeling well. Can you finish this order? Evan has a networking event tonight. They spoke as if Evan were made of glass, and I was made of steel. And because I always said yes, they learned they never had to ask anyone else. The forge stopped feeling like a place where I built things and slowly became the place where I was being whittled down. Every time I picked up a tool, I felt a subtle shift in what was expected from me, not appreciation, but dependence. My mother was the one who first hinted at temporary liquidity issues. She said it with a rehearsed softness, as if the phrasing itself was more important than the truth. The company was short on cash, and since I was the only one with savings, she suggested I invest in the family's future. She promised they would pay me back. She always promised. I covered a supplier invoice, then a repair bill, then payroll when we hit a slow month. And with each loan, the silence stretched longer until the money felt like it had never existed at all. My own bank account slowly drained without anyone noticing but me. I kept working because that was what I had been trained to do. My worth to them had become synonymous with my output. Meanwhile, my father had begun passing more of his responsibilities to me, not because I asked for them, but because it was easier for him. At first, it felt like trust. Later, it felt like the weight of an entire building settling onto my spine. When a client had a complaint, they sent them to me. When a rush job came in, it landed on my bench. When Evan miscalculated a bid, I was the one who stayed late correcting it. He ordered the wrong materials. I improvised. He promised impossible timelines. I sacrificed sleep. Somehow, Evan kept the title of strategic mind, while I absorbed the consequences of his decisions. But the moment everything shifted from burden to something darker came half a year before I left. We had secured a contract to fabricate a custom steel mezzanine for a historic warehouse, a project with strict load requirements and no room for shortcuts. I loved jobs like that, where precision mattered, where the steel demanded respect. But Evan didn't see it that way. He'd found cheaper imported steel and wanted to swap it in to boost margins. When I told him it wasn't strong enough, he brushed me off. My parents backed him, calling me inflexible, dramatic, overcautious. My father even said, "Just weld it cleanly. It'll hold," telling me to ignore the standards he once drilled into me as sacred. That was the first time I realized they weren't asking me to compromise. They were asking me to lie with my hands, my craft, my integrity. That night, I stood alone in the workshop, staring at the substandard steel Evan had ordered. I ran my hand along it and felt the difference instantly: the wrong density, the wrong flex, the wrong sole. I stayed long after the lights should have been off, wondering how I had become someone expected to break the rules that had shaped my entire life. The idea of leaving surfaced in my mind for the first time, brief as a spark, but bright enough to scare me. I had never envisioned a life outside of Ironclad Forge. I had been built, shaped to belong there. But the thought didn't leave. It grew roots. My parents sensed my resistance and tightened the leash. Suddenly, my purchases had to be approved. Suddenly, Evan had final authority over my projects. Suddenly, they questioned every method I used, even the ones proven over a decade. They weren't evaluating me. They were punishing me. And the more I stood my ground, the more unreasonable their expectations became. They framed my boundaries as betrayal, my silence as selfishness, my exhaustion as weakness. They needed me to be dependable, silent, and endlessly capable. And when I wasn't, the entire system started to creak. I didn't see it then, but they were afraid. Not of losing me. They never believed I would leave, but of losing the stability I provided. My work had become the invisible skeleton of the business, and they had been leaning on it so long they forgot the skeleton was made of a person. Every guilt trip, every request for just one more hour, every passive-aggressive comment about my attitude was another strand of a web designed to keep me from remembering I had options. Even when I felt the resentment building in my chest, even when I knew something was deeply, structurally wrong, I stayed. Because that was who they needed me to be. Because they had raised me into a tool, not a partner. Because walking away felt like dropping the beam holding up the roof. And they were confident, absolutely confident, that I would never risk letting the roof fall. They weren't wrong. Not yet. But the tension was building. And wood or steel can only handle so much pressure before the break becomes inevitable. The night everything finally snapped didn't look dramatic from the outside. There was no shouting, no smash tools, no slammed doors. It happened in the kind of silence that feels heavy enough to bend light. I had stayed late at the workshop again past midnight, long after anyone else cared enough to be there. The forge smelled of cooling steel and burnt flux. The usual perfume of a day stretched too thin. I was finishing a series of welds. Evan had promised a client would be ready by morning. Even though he had spent the entire afternoon pitching innovative workflow strategies to a startup incubator that had no idea what we actually did for a living. I remember the moment exactly. I was wiping down the bead I'd just laid when I heard footsteps behind me. My father's steps were heavy and slow, but Evan's had a specific arrogance to them. Light. Quick. The kind of footsteps a man has when he thinks gravity doesn't apply to him. I turned to see both of them standing there, my father with disappointment brewing in his eyes, Evan with a smirk polished to a shine. "We need to talk," my father said. I already knew nothing good ever followed those words. Evan crossed his arms. "I've been reviewing the workflows," he said, like he was giving a TED Talk. "And I think it's best if all production decisions come through me first from now on. Clients respond better to leadership with a business background." He said it with that tone he used when he wanted to sound collaborative, but was really issuing orders. I stared at him. Then, at my father, waiting for the punchline. It didn't come. My father cleared his throat. "We've all noticed your attitude lately. You've been resistant, combative, for refusing to cut corners, for saving their contracts, for keeping the business from collapsing under the weight of Evan's shortcuts." Hearing that word felt like someone driving a nail straight into my sternum. Evan took a step closer, lowering his voice like he was doing me a kindness. "Look, man, you're good with your hands. Really good. But you're not the big picture guy. That's fine. Not everyone can be." He said it with the confidence of someone who had never built a single thing that didn't involve dragging and dropping into a template. My father nodded along, as if the golden child's words were scripture. Then Evan delivered the blow that hollowed me out. "We're considering moving you into more of a support role. less decision-making, more execution. It's more aligned with your strengths. My strengths. The ones that built the entire damn company. The ones he couldn't function without. I felt something inside me shift. Not anger, something colder. Something final. It was the moment I realized they weren't making a mistake. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate demotion wrapped in the language of leadership development. They were pushing me out of the future because, in their minds, I didn't belong in it. My father added, "It's what's best for the business." He didn't even look at me. He looked at Evan, waiting for his approval. That was the moment I understood something terrifying in its clarity. They weren't trying to correct me. They were trying to contain me, to shrink me back into the role that kept their world stable. They wanted me obedient, predictable, silent. I looked down at my hands, scarred, burned, hardened by years of work. These hands knew truth. Steel doesn't lie. Heat doesn't lie. But people do. Families do. And mine had perfected the craft. The realization landed with a clean, quiet click. This wasn't about efficiency. This wasn't about workflow. This was about control. And I was done letting them hold the reins. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply said, "All right." And the way both of them actually relaxed, told me everything. Evan grinned, satisfied. My father sighed, relieved. They believed they had successfully put me back into my place. They had no idea that in that moment, I had decided to leave. Not later, not eventually, but soon enough to change the entire trajectory of their lives. It's strange how breaking points work. You expect them to be explosive, but mine was silent. A fault line shifting beneath the surface. A clean internal fracture. The kind that doesn't just break, you can feel it rearranging the entire structure of who you were. And by the time they walked out of the workshop that night, thinking they had won, I already knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never let them use me again. When I finally walked out of the workshop after that conversation, the cold air hit me like a reminder that the world outside my family's orbit still existed. For years, everything I did, every hour I sacrificed, every bruise and burn I carried had been funneled into a single belief that eventually my loyalty would be recognized. That belief died the moment they told me I belonged in a support role. What they didn't realize was that by shrinking me, they had freed me. And once I was free, the power dynamic of our entire family shifted without a sound. I didn't leave immediately. Quiet revenge requires patience. It requires precision. It requires the same discipline as forging steel: heat, pressure, and timing. I waited until 2 in the morning, when the house was quiet and the workshop slept like a dormant giant. I didn't steal anything that belonged to Ironclad Forge. I only collected what was mine. The precision tools I had bought with my own money. The custom clamps I'd built over the years. The handmade jigs and specialty nozzles that existed only because I created them during my off hours. They had always been personal property extensions of my hands, and I wasn't leaving them behind for Evan to ruin. Then came the harder part. I went into the office and opened the company server. They thought everything I created belonged to the business. But that wasn't true. Every blueprint, every welding sequence, every jig design, every fixture concept for the high-end fabrication work I specialized in, none of it was made on company time. These were designs I had spent years refining at home, on weekends, in notebooks and CAD files that predated the projects themselves. It was my intellectual property, and leaving it behind would have been a gift to people who had never respected its value. So I removed it. All of it. I wiped the server clean of anything I had personally created. Not the company data. Not client contracts. Only the work that originated from my mind. If Evan was the strategic visionary, then he should have no trouble producing new designs on his own. That was the thought that carried me through the process. I left my workshop key on my father's desk, placing it carefully in the moonlight that slanted through the window. Then I wrote a note, 5 words. Nothing more. Good luck with the steel. I walked out without looking back. The house was dark, silent, oblivious. It felt like the moment before a structure collapses, stillness right before the dust rises. The next morning, the calls began. At first, they were annoyed. My mother's text read, "Where are you, client arriving early?" Then the calls turned insistent, then frantic. They couldn't find the mezzanine design. They couldn't locate the custom specs for the reinforcement beams. My father's messages shifted from irritation to desperation, and Evan's from arrogance to outright panic. I didn't answer any of them. I blocked their numbers one by one, letting the silence settle like new snow. But the quiet didn't last for long. 2 days later, I received a call from someone I didn't expect. Mr. Langley, the architect overseeing the largest contract the Forge had landed in years. Ironclad Forge had marketed themselves as the only shop capable of handling the precision-required historical renovation. What Langley actually hired was me. And without me, the project was falling apart. He said Evan had tried persuading him to switch to cheaper materials, calling it cost-effective innovation. Langley walked out before the conversation even ended. When he asked if I was available to take the project on my own, I hesitated. I didn't have a space. I didn't have the infrastructure, but I had skill. And for the first time in my life, I had leverage. He offered an advance on materials and equipment, a challenge, a lifeline, a vote of confidence wrapped in a single question. Are you a fabricator? Or were you just their employee? I chose myself. I found an old storage barn outside of town, drafty, cold, neglected but large enough to hold a dream. I signed the lease using the last of my savings. For 3 days, I worked through the cold, leveling floors, wiring generators, clearing space. When I finally powered up my welder and made the first cut in that half-frozen barn, the sound echoed differently. It didn't sound like labor. It sounded like ownership. While setting up the new shop, I asked my friend, now a commercial real estate attorney, to look into Ironclad Forge's property records. Just to be safe, I'd said. But what she found wasn't safety. It was a nightmare in legal form. The property had been leveraged for a high-interest loan months earlier, a loan tied to one of Evan's disastrous investment schemes. The building, the land, the equipment, everything my grandfather built was drowning in debt. If I had stayed, I would have spent the rest of my life trying to pay off a hole Evan had dug with a pin and a smile. The realization hit me with brutal clarity. I hadn't abandoned my family. I had escaped them. The confrontation didn't happen at the forge, or at my barn, or even somewhere private, where tempers could quietly burn and die out. It happened in the most public, unignorable place possible, the lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel. Downtown, a place filled with polished marble floors, golden chandeliers, and the kind of acoustics that make raised voices echo like gunfire. I didn't choose the location. Life chose it for me. Langley had arranged a meeting with Ironclad Forge to finalize the cancellation of their contract. He had already reassigned the project to me quietly, but needed to handle the legal steps that would sever their remaining claims on the work. He asked if I wanted to be there. I told him I didn't need to be, but a part of me knew that avoiding it was just another way of staying small. So I went. I arrived early, wearing clothes that smelled faintly of welding fumes and cedar oil. Not fancy, not polished, but undeniably me. When the elevator doors opened on the mezzanine lobby, I saw them instantly. My parents stood near the front desk, stiff with dread, and Evan paced in short, sharp lines like a trapped animal. They didn't see me at first. I watched them from a distance, and for once, I didn't feel the guilt that always came with their fear. I felt something closer to truth. The truth that they were responsible for the shape of this moment, not me. Langley stepped out from a hallway, spotted me, and gave a curt nod. "You ready?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, though every muscle in my body felt like a drawn wire. He motioned for me to follow. And when we approached, the moment they recognized me was almost theatrical. My mother's eyes widened. My father's shoulders tensed. Evan stopped pacing, the color rising to his face. "What is he doing here?" Evan demanded immediately, gesturing at me like I was a violation of some sacred rule. "I invited him," Langley said, his tone crisp enough to cut glass. My father tried to smile, but it looked painful. Haley, you didn't return our calls. Your mother, she hasn't slept in days. His voice cracked on the last word. But it wasn't guilt I felt, it was distance. A cold, steady distance I'd never known before. We can talk later, my mother said quickly, stepping forward as if trying to fold me back into their orbit by sheer force of will. This contract meeting is important. Let's handle this like a family. We're not here as a family, Langley said, stepping between us. We're here as parties to a contract, and there have been complications. Evan scoffed. Complications. The complication is that he jabbed a finger at me, stole proprietary designs, and sabotaged our operations. No, I said simply. It wasn't an argument. It was a correction. You deleted company data, Evan snapped. I deleted my designs. I replied. The ones I made on my own time. The ones you never understood in the first place. My father bristled. We trusted you. Adi-san. You used me. I said, those aren't the same thing. Before they could answer, Langley lifted a folder. Let's move forward. Ironclad Forge is being formally removed from the contract due to breach of quality standards and failure to maintain necessary technical competency. My mother's hands flew to her mouth. My father staggered like he'd been struck. Evan went rigid. That's impossible, Evan said, trying to laugh. But the sound cracked in half. We're the only forge in the region certified for this kind of historical reinforcement. You were. Langley corrected him. Your certification lapsed when your primary fabricator left. My father blinked. Primary fabricator. Haley, Langley said, turning to me, was the only certified artisan on your team. Without him, you no longer meet state requirements. I assumed you knew this. My parents didn't respond. They didn't have to. The truth was obvious on their faces. I can run the projects. Evan insisted. We don't need him. I have a degree. A degree isn't a certification, Langley said sharply. And a buzzword isn't a weld. The air went still. My mother closed her eyes. My father stared at the floor. And Evan looked at me with hatred so sharp it almost glittered. This is your fault. He spat. You abandoned us. You destroyed everything. No, I said quietly. You destroyed it when you thought you could run a forge without knowing the difference between strong steel and cheap steel. You destroyed it when you leveraged the property for a loan you didn't understand. You destroyed it when you expected me to clean up every mistake while calling it leadership. My father stepped forward, voice trembling. We can fix this. Haley, please, just come back. We can renegotiate your role. I almost admired the desperation. Almost. Renegotiate it to what I asked. Support staff. Assistant laborer. The person who takes responsibility for your decisions, but gets none of the credit. It wouldn't be like that anymore. My mother whispered. But even she didn't believe it. Langley cleared his throat. There's another matter. Ironclad Forge attempted to misrepresent material specifications to cut costs. We have emails. He lifted another document. Your son Evan suggested using inferior steel on a historical structure. That alone would void the contract. My father rounded on Evan. Tell me that isn't true. I was optimizing efficiency, Evan shouted. You always told me to think strategically. That wasn't strategy. I said, that was ignorance dressed up as innovation. The argument that erupted between them echoed across the marble. My parents blamed Evan. Evan blamed them. Voices rose. Accusations flew. Decades of denial unraveled in minutes. And for the first time in my life, I watched it without feeling responsible for holding it together. I didn't step in. I didn't mediate. I didn't soothe. I simply stood there and let the shards fall where they belonged. Finally, when their voices ran dry, I stepped forward. This is my boundary. I said, I'm done saving you. I'm done fixing what you break. I'm done carrying a burden that was never mine. My father's eyes shone not with anger, but with something far more fragile. We're still your family. No, I said gently. Your blood. Family is chosen. I turned toward the exit. The sunlight through the glass doors lit the floor in long, warm strips, and for the first time, walking away didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like arrival. My mother reached out one last time, voice cracking. "Haley, please, where are you going?" I didn't turn back. "Forward," I said, and I walked out, leaving the echo of their collapse behind me. The fallout hit ironclad forge like a slow-moving avalanche. Not loud, not sudden, but unstoppable. Without the certification, without the contracts, without the trust of the architects and builders who once relied on our precision, the business crumbled. My parents fought to keep it afloat, but fighting gravity has only one outcome. Within 6 weeks, the bank stepped in. The property was appraised, evaluated, and prepared for liquidation. The place I once believed would be my inheritance became a line item on an auction sheet. I didn't attend because I wanted closure. I went because I wanted truth. Truth doesn't come from apologies or speeches, it comes from seeing things as they are, stripped of illusion. When I stepped into the cold warehouse where the auction was held, it felt like walking into a past life. Machines I had repaired, tools I had rescued from obsolescence, the equipment I had coaxed through late-night deadlines, all lined up under fluorescent lights, like relics of someone else's story. The room echoed with the murmurs of bidders who saw opportunity where I saw a tomb. My parents stood off to the side, smaller than I remembered. Not physically, they were the same, but the aura they once carried, that towering parental authority, it was gone. Evan paced beside them, muttering under his breath, blaming anyone who would listen. They didn't see me at first, and when they finally did, their expressions flickered with a dozen emotions: regret, disbelief, something like grief. But none of those emotions belonged to me anymore. I watched as the auctioneer's voice ricocheted through the space, selling off the infrastructure of my childhood, one piece at a time. I didn't flinch when strangers bought the plasma cutter I learned on, or the press brake I spent my teenage summers using. But when Lot 57 rolled forward a scarred, heavy workbench, stained with years of sweat and molten steel, I felt something shift. That bench had been my grandfather's. It was where he taught me how to hold a torch, how to listen to metal, how to understand that strength and flexibility weren't opposites, but partners. When the bidding started, no one seemed to care much for it. Too old, too analog, too slow for modern shops. But to me, it was the only piece of ironclad forge worth saving. I raised my paddle. I bought it for a fraction of what it was truly worth. And as the auction moved on, I walked out into the winter air feeling lighter than I had in years. Now the bench sits in the center of my new workshop, a space filled with the crackle of sparks, the hum of machinery, and the steady rhythm of purposeful work. I have a small team now, apprentices who come in eager, curious, willing to learn. I teach them the way my grandfather taught me: the metal doesn't lie. Respect it, and it will respect you back. My life isn't loud anymore. It isn't dramatic. It isn't built on debt or deception or conditional love. It's built on integrity, on skill, on boundaries that no longer bend until they break. For the first time, I'm not holding up a world that would collapse without me. I'm building one that stands on its own. And if you're listening to this, if you've ever had to leave something you thought defined you just to discover who you really were, I want you to know something: walking away isn't failure. Sometimes, it's the first true act of self-respect. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to stop trying to save everyone else. If you've ever been the one holding everything together while others got the credit, or if you've ever rebuilt your life from the ashes of someone else's expectations, share your story below. You're not alone. If this story spoke to you, consider supporting the channel so we can keep creating meaningful, cinematic narratives each week. Your engagement helps this community grow. Like, comment, and subscribe if you want more stories like this. This content is created purely for entertainment and storytelling purposes. Names, events, and details are fictional. Please do not replicate any actions or decisions depicted in this narrative.